Hello and welcome to our weekly share on the Parsha. The last 2 years, of course, we've been learning the Alshich. But this year, I asked you last week, those who were with me, just grab something to clean my glasses, who were with me last week, I asked you the question, would you be happy if we, instead of doing a third year of the Alshich, if we changed it and I wanted to have the weekly share with the commentaries, the various commentaries of the great Gedolim of the Yeshiva of Kelm, Rav Simcha Zissel, Rebbe Yerucham, Rabbi Dessler, and others. And so thank you for those who actually go back to me, which is very nice. People are actually out there listening. And the conclusion was that people are quite happy for us to do that. And that's what we're going to do. So as usual, the share is dedicated for the Refuah Shalema of Ori Chaim ben Chala Yehudis. That's the little boy who's waiting for a transplant. Refuah Chaim ben Sora, who's been struggling with illness for a while. And we are quite convinced that we are helping his Refuah with our share together. Ita Rivka Basima Esther, that's my wife who's recovering from a complete knee replacement. And Yecheskel Yehuda Ben Yenta is recovering from serious surgery in Eretz Yisrael. Is a very dear friend and a distant cousin. Okay, that is all we have to launch this year. And as I've told you so many times, if you would like to have the share dedicated for a refuah for somebody you know, or for to celebrate the Simcha, let's make this happy. Maybe a bar mitzvah coming up, or a wedding coming up, or some nice happy event, then please let me know, and I will be very happy to dedicate the share for you in that way. Oh, the people usually ask how much is the dedication? $180, and you get the share dedicated for somebody you love. This week's parsha we're going to be examining through the lens of Rav Simcha Zissel and Rabbi Dessler. We're going to be looking at the story of Lot and the peculiar paradox of Lot. And of course, there's so very much to say about that. But let me just start with Rabbi Dessler. And Rabbi Dessler, you'll find in the Chelik Aleph of Mikta Milion, it's this famous essay in page 111, although we were going to be starting in page 115, in which he gives a very interesting insight from Rav Nosson Finkel, who was the founder of Slobodka, the quintessential Litvish yeshiva that gave birth to so many others, when he talks about Lot. And he says the following thing. He says, but Parshas, we're talking about Parshas Lot, Chesed hoyechelkel shel Avrohom. Chesed, that was the nature of Avram Avinu, obviously, and we all know that. The Midah Toras says that Hashem gave Chesed to Avram. That was his particular bailiwick, his particular role, and of course, by definition, Sora's too. Avram was mashpia on the men. Sora influenced the woman. Now, the interesting and astonishing thing is here, he says, that anybody who came into contact with Avram Avinu automatically had an aliyah, had a leap in their own midah, their own character trait of chesed. It was immediately increased, and the volume was turned up simply by proximity, simply by closeness, or even just seeing Avram Avinu. That itself was enough to be inspirational. I suppose it's like any pure energy. If you stood next to a glacier, I would imagine you would become cold. If you stood next to a fire, you would become warm. If, God forbid, you stood next to a radioactive isotope, there's definitely a possibility the effect could be that you could become radioactive. Anything which is strong, pure energy affects that and those round about it. And certainly that's the case with regards to Avram Avinu. Avram Avinu is the personification. He is pure chesed. In human form. And as a consequence of that, anybody who saw him, well, let me go back to Rav Nosson Finkel, Chesed hi chelko shel Avram, that's the chelik of Avram, that's his role. And call me Sharo, anybody who saw him, is alam b'chesed b'mesiras nefesh noiras. They themselves, their chesed was so increased, even to the stage of mesiras nefesh, of self-sacrifice for the sake of it, and maybe even self-sacrifice literally, sacrifice yourself because of the chesed you, just by proximity to Avram Avinu. And such a person was Lot. So if that's the case, we're scratching our heads here. After all, Lot's relationship to Avram Avinu was that he was his uncle, he was his Rebbe, and of course he's eventually going to become his brother-in-law. The relationship was very, very close. And I would really quite have liked to have Avram Avinu as my Rebbe, although I'm not complaining at all of the Rebbes I've had in my life. But imagine having Avram Avinu as your Rebbe. What is that going to do to the sort of person that you become? So let's go over to Rav Simcha Zissel in his commentary on the Torah, 2 volume, as we saw last week, Sefer Or Rishaz. And there's a point he makes very, very forcefully. But the point, I'm going to read what he says here, but the point he's going to make is going to leave us with an enormous question. Because if he is the disciple of Avrohom Avinu, and the relative of Avrohom Avinu, and as it were, his exposure to his Rebbe, it was from the egg, from the very beginning of his life, then there is a paradox and a question. Well, let me just read a little bit of what Rav Simcha Zissel has to say, and you'll see where we have to go from here. So he says, when I consider who and what Lot was in Parshas Voyairo, this week's Parsha, it's quite obvious. The Torah makes it quite clear that he was a Tzadik. Whether you're talking about being Adam Lamokim in his interrelationship with Hashem Yisborach, or whether we're talking about his relationship with other human beings. And then he gives lots of the examples of this. The astonishing thing is that he sat, as Rashi says in the Chumash, when the two angels who are in human form come into Sodom, when he is there, then it is a case of seeing these angels and thinking they're human beings. And immediately he goes up and offers them hospitality. But the astonishing thing is, Rashi says there, he at that day, at that time, had been appointed to become the head judge, effectively I would say the mayor, with real legislative power of the city of Sodom, which is astonishing. And yet this man who is can you imagine somebody, the president of the country seeing somebody and rushing over to offer them hospitality? You normally have so many bodyguards, you never get near such people. He sees them and he rushes over. Come over, as Rashi says. Rashi says when he saw strangers coming in, he rushes, but not only did he rush at war with them, he falls down, he bows down to these seeming strangers. And he says to them, my masters, and calls himself, allow your servant to escort you into his house. And when he offers them all this honor and all this respect, it should really have worked out that this is no ordinary person offering them hospitality. The ruler of the city, Lord, the head of the Supreme Court would be, I suppose, the best analogy. And he's offering us hospitality. But take up Medrach Lagal Sarah ear novel if name Batakal Home the Ball of Vezai. He's asking us to come and have his hospitality. Take of him yad. Immediately she got up when they saw that and said, yes, wow. But they don't do that. They refuse. They say they're going to sleep in the street or in the town square. And that's not acceptable to Lot, who takes them and brings them into his house. Astonishing. Raw and Nedvos, I'm missing a little bit. You see here two things: his chesed to complete strangers, and his humility. Lifnei gerim, complete strangers, by him outside. So that was enough of an illustration. I'll come back to Rabbi Desser in a minute to see more of the greatness of Lot when his interactions with other human beings. Astonishing stuff. Rav Simcha Zissel also goes on to say that when there's the whole thing later when they try to break down the door to get his guests because they're going to assault them in the most appalling way, and when he declares that his daughters have never been with a man, says Rabbi Desser, that means that they had never been with a man, which is very, very strange for somebody brought up as they were in Sodom. But he totally rejected who and what Sodom was all about, and that's astonishing. So therefore, we've got somebody who's living in Sodom, and he's rejected their values. They seem to recognize in him greatness because they've appointed him to be the head of the city. And yet that night they attack, or they attack his house, and they want to get these guests and to sodomize them. This is a contradiction. But before we consider that a little bit deeper, more deeply, let's look at what the next paragraph when he points out the greatness of Lot and his relationship to Hashem. When it comes to his relationship with Hashem, because it says when no, I'll read this too. I think this me. Let's do the dramatic bit and actually read this. Two angels come to Sodom, and I'll read this in the translation. And he urged them very much, and they turned towards him. Came to says he made a feast for them and baked matzah, and he baked them matzah. What do I bake them matzah? So Rashi says there he baked them matzah because it was Pesach. And as Rav Simcha Zissel says, that he, like the Obbas, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, kept the Torah before it was given. They have insights into the future, prophecy, and they see what's going to happen. And he's a Talmud of Avram Avinu. So Pesach is on their calendar. It's in their diary, even before the events that they created Pesach were ever going to take place. Mahasas Asad was here and he obviously does this with passion and with alacrity. So he kept the mitzvah of Pesach and all the other mitzvahs which had not yet been given, but the same alacrity as we saw demonstrated when he rushes to offer his hospitality to these strangers. So in both aspects of his nature, he is a great person. And with his background, it would be hardly surprising he was a great person. So here's the question I've been considering, and maybe we think it would be appropriate to consider too. As I said before, the whole journey of Avram Avinu and Sarah is to change the world. And anybody who came into contact with them was so inspired that they followed in their footsteps. The nephew also Voyairo said in last week's Sedra, when Avram goes and leaves the land of his birth, he takes all the souls that he'd made with him in Haran, they followed too. He had a huge following of disciples and people who had bought into his worldview, his religion, became very, very, in a very, very high level. It's interesting to note, and this is going to be echoing in this week's Parsha, that none of Avram's Gerim, Avram's converts, were able to sustain their attachment to his beliefs to the next generation. With his death, that movement died. The passing on of that movement would only be through his own son, to Yitzchak, to Yaakov, through the Jewish people. But his direct Hasidim, when he passes away, it dies as well. And with regards to Lot, here is somebody who is undoubtedly reached an incredibly high spiritual level. And his chesed is inspired by Avrohom's chesed. He's learned it from Avrohom. So why wasn't he able to pass that on to the city of Sodom? Indeed, that very day, they appointed him to be the head of the Supreme Court. But the strange thing is, when he invites these people in, which is a capital crime, by the way, in Sodom society, to offer hospitality was a capital crime. What was this? Sounds strange that night, the man they've just appointed to be the head of the Supreme Court, is suddenly there's a riot outside his house. Sadly, in today's world, and particularly if you live in the United States of America, as I do, you will have noticed that in the recent decisions of the Supreme Court, the justices of the Supreme Court, those perceived to be likely to pass legislation which was unacceptable to the left, faced massive demonstrations, threatening demonstrations outside their houses. In other words, they were quite happy to have him as long as he was going to, as it were, play the game by their rules, but not by his own. But that's my problem. My problem is, why didn't he have the same effect and make them into the sort of converts, the sort of disciples that Avram Avinu did? Because he was, as it were, in the same mold. Well, in fact, he was molded by Avram Avinu, would be a better way to say that. Okay, so that's the question. To understand that, we have to look at page 116, and now we're swapping about, back to Rabbi Dessler, of Michtav Eliyahu. And when we look here, it says the following interesting thing. So Rabbi Dessler says, and again, this is page 115 in Michtav Eliyahu, and it's called Chinuch v'Aliyah, education and spiritual level, going up at a high spiritual level. Before Lona Mikol Zev, we see from all that we've said previously, Now, this is very, very challenging and very, very interesting idea. That the zechus, the level, the real person is not of a Jew, the real level of a Jew is not demonstrated, not apparent in the behavior and the behaviors that he or she carries out, which are as a consequence of their education and their background. So he says, but rather through the bechira, the choices that he or she makes in their own life. Because where you have been, the point at which a person has been educated to, is the point at which his own life, his own, what's the word in English? Individual choices begin. That's where it starts. So everybody's got freedom of choice, as Rabbi Dessler says in this famous essay. It's where the point of choice starts. But the education you have, that will be your starting point, your springboard to where you're going to take it to. Fine. And so if we turn the page, Rabbi Dessler says an astonishing thing. He says, with regards to when it comes to Avram Avinu, it says in the story of Lot, Lot is facing a city which is about to be destroyed. The angels are evacuating him from the coming storm. And the Pasuk says, Vayiskar Elohim es Avram, and Hashem remembered Avram and saved Lot. Hashem remembers Avram and he saves Lot. What did he remember? Yiska, says Rashi, Yiska shahoyu Lot yedei shosari ishta shel Avram. So he knew that Sarah, of course, was the wife of Avram. They had been in Egypt. When they were in Egypt, of course, Avram pretended that Sarah was his sister, and that he never revealed to Pharaoh. Now, because he never revealed to Pharaoh that Sarah, the most beautiful woman in the world, was in actual fact his wife, which would have led Pharaoh to kill Avram and take her, that allowed him to see him as a potential brother-in-law, try and befriend him, which allowed Avram to speak, because incidentally, Avram had a koyach hapeh. Avram had a brilliant ability to make people see things differently by the way he spoke. All he really needed to do was the opportunity to speak, and he could make a difference. So Lot knew that this pretense was happening. If he dropped the tiniest little hint, the sort of hint that we sometimes drop and pretend to ourselves that we didn't, or can pretend to ourselves that we didn't, then if that is the case, then it's going to be that Avram Avinu will be killed, and he will become the brother-in-law of the most rich and powerful man in the world. Because he didn't do that, and that's why he merits to be saved from the destruction of Sodom. Just Rabbi Dessler says this is absolutely astonishing. What? He says, I mean, who would do such a thing? Ella, Yashav Zol Moisa, the fact that the greatness of Lot is demonstrated in the fact that he didn't and wasn't willing to inform his brother-in-law, have him killed, his teacher, his uncle. Lamar says, no, even the worst possible person wouldn't do this. Now, Rabbi Dessler says something else which is astonishing. He quotes the Medrash, which says that Lot, of course, we know has two daughters, but the Medrash said Lot actually had three daughters. One daughter had offered hospitality to a stranger, just, of course, as he does in the beginning of the story. And when she does so, she's put on trial. She's found guilty for the capital crime of offering hospitality to a stranger. The punishment for that is death. And he has to watch her die in the most horrible way you can imagine, by being eaten alive by insects. Which takes, it's not going to take minutes. It's going to take a long, long time of screaming agony. And yet straight after that, then Lot is willing to do the exact same thing when strangers come to town. Now, you might say about this stage, he was even appointed to the head of the town. But it shows the greatness of the chesed of Lot. But it says Rabbi Dessler, yes, of course it was great. But that was the greatness he was educated into. He was given as a gift. For him, it was programmed from the get-go, from the egg sort of thing, by his association and contact with the great Avram Avinu. That meant they had, as it were, without his control, without exercising any choice. He was naturally a great Baal Chesed. But being a great Baal Chesed, when you're not choosing, that's not such a big deal. And even though, says Rabbi Dester, Hashem does not um, uh, ignore that. He still gives you the reward for the work, the things you've done, even though it's not truly you. But the real reward is what is truly you. This is the background. What's the foreground? Where did you take it to? When he's faced with the opportunity to become the brother-in-law of Pharaoh, the richest man in the world, most powerful man in the world, for him, that was a challenge. Because why is he living in Sodom in the first place? Well, when there's the conflict between the shepherds of Lot and the shepherds of Avrohom, and Avrohom says, whichever direction you want to go, if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Whichever, just, you choose. He chooses Sodom. Why? The Pasuk says, because he saw it was a beautiful land. And the fight was over the fact that Avram and Lot had lots of sheep, lots of cattle, and there wasn't enough grazing, but there'd be a lot of grazing there, and therefore there'd be a lot of money to make. That's the nature of Lot. He likes money. He's a materialist. And people who like money, who happen to be, become closely related to the most powerful man in the world, you might make a lot of money. He rejected that. That's the ultimate zechus, the ultimate merit that he gets, that justifies him getting out from Sodom without being destroyed in the overthrow of Sodom. Rav Simcha Zissel says it slightly differently, and he says, with regards to having explained the greatness of Lot, he then says the following thing. This is on page Kufkov Vov. Lot can yispard me Avram b'shvil mara. When Lot separates himself from Avram because of money, because of the grazing that was available there, in other words, because of money, it was obvious, it became obvious that his real nature, his fight, the reason he was here, the part of him that he had to overcome was that desire for money and riches. And consequently, to not separate himself from Avram Avinu, this giant amongst giants, he says. And the reason he did so, because he liked money so much. That this desire for money and taiva is they're both the same thing, both each side of the same coin. Well, that made him choose to go to Sodom. Because he was quite convinced that he could easily and safely go and live in Sodom without Sodom in any way influencing him. Because, listen to this, because what they held, their views, their behavior, he was appalled by. He's just there to make money. He's not going to be influenced by them. He detested what they stood for. As Rav Simcha Zissel said, he was a great Tzadik. Because it was already implanted within him. Roots, deep roots, put down by Avram Avinu. So he was immune, he felt, from the effects of living amongst them. So he could make a huge living there. And he would not be affected by the negative, but he would be able to affect them positively. And he seems to have made progress in that. The day when the two angels come to destroy Sodom, they've appointed him to be the head of the city. He's inoculated. He's not going to get COVID. He's had his two vaccinations plus boosters through Avram Avinu. And the truth is, he wasn't. You could see that he wasn't affected by their rejection of chesed. He rushes to offer these people chesed. He's not become a huge Baal Gaiva. I remember once in Austria, seeing on a wall, this was, a long time ago. But this is well after the Second World War, still graffiti in the walls. Auslanders raus, foreigners out. That's still the attitude of many Austrians and many Germans. It was the aliens don't belong. And here is Lot, who's now been pointed to the head of the city, going and making sure that they're looked after. Right. So he says, skipping a little bit, "Abagam miznus hayabene besodakim." And not only that, they protected themselves from this, from sexual immorality. Kashen is born because of Asher Lo Yoda Ish, as we said. When he says about his daughters, they were had never had any contact with men because he kept them away from men. That was who they were. And the whole story of the incestuous relationship that comes after the destruction of Sodom, we've covered that in previous shirim, but Rav Simcha Zissel takes it on as a very simple thing, very straightforward, I should say, that it was not a sexual thing for the sake of physical gratification, but rather it was for the sake of, they thought the whole world had been wiped out, that this was just these destruction of 5 cities. Sodom was a conurbation of 5 cities, like New York is, by the way, Brooklyn and Staten Island and Manhattan, etc., etc. They thought it was all finished, and they had to do this. Is the only way they could make humanity carry on. So he seems to be right, doesn't he? And yet he's not right. He's not quite right. Because if he had been truly successful, then there would have not been Sodom. So why wasn't he, back to our question, why wasn't he able to influence them the same way as Avram was able to influence his people, who probably behaved in very similar horrible ways before they made contact with Avram Avinu? Anybody who saw Avram Avinu had a huge boost in their own midah of chesed. Such a person was Lot. He's a great tzaddik. Why didn't that influence other people in his generation as well? Good. So if we look at Rabbi Dessler in page 153 of Mikta Miliyahu, then he says the following fabulous and wonderful thing. This essay is called Hashpasa Sviva, the negative influence of being in a negative environment. Everybody knows that when Moshe Rabbeinu runs away from Paro, he finds refuge in the house of somebody called Yisro, who's eventually going to become Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, one of the greatest Jews who ever lived, because of course he converts. Not only just a great person, but somebody who innovates in Klal Yisrael, and who gets himself a whole Sedra in the Torah named after him. And thinking about it last night when I was thinking about our share, it's interesting that obviously Lot could have had a Sedra named after himself in the Torah had he not failed. Where was his failure? So he's quite confident he's going to go to Sodom, and it's not going to negatively influence him. But the real reason he's there is because of money. A little thing, money. But that thing, this wanting physical comfort, that tiny seed is going to grow and grow. He gets himself drunk, and of course that leads to the whole incestuous thing. It's there, it's still there. He hasn't quite got rid of that. That money thing, he didn't fall into the great trap, which the informing in Avram Avinu, which would have delivered him $2 billion. Somebody won $2 billion in the American lottery last week. That sort of money would have brought to him. He would overcome that, but it was still there. That seed was still there. But let's go back to this. So this is Rabbi Dessler. So Moshe runs away and he finds refuge in the house of Yisro. And the pasuk says in the Torah, "Voyairo Moshe l'sheves as ish," and this is in Shemai's base and Kaf Aleph. And Moshe was content to dwell with the man. Voyairo, to be content, which makes a lot of sense. But the Hebrew word vayal also means an oath, an olah. And what was the oath? So the Medrash says that when he came to Yisro to ask for his daughter's hand in marriage, Yisro said, sure, on one condition. What was the condition? That you give away your first son to avoid Zorah. That you give away your first son to avoid Zorah. Now we're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, the greatest Jew who ever lived. And now this fellow, this non-Jewish fellow, is saying to him, if you want me to be your father-in-law, you want my daughter's hand in marriage, then you've got to give away your firstborn son to avoid Zorah. So nobody was as great as Moshe Rabbeinu. How do you think Moshe Rabbeinu replied to that invitation, that deal? So the Maral says he said yes, quoting the Medrash. He said yes. This is a Yalkut Shimoni. He said yes, and Yisro said swear it. He swore it. And he swore that he would give away his firstborn son to Avodah Zarah? Does this make any sense? So the Moral of Prague says in Toras an astonishing thing. He says, often the rabbis will tell you a story in the Talmud about somebody which never actually happened, but as it were, the story is almost a moshel which reveals something about the person, a truth about the person, which, as it were, could happen. Imagine somebody who is a frum fellow, frum boy, frum girl. They've always wondered, what does bacon taste like? No, they've never tasted it. But if they're walking past a non-Jewish restaurant, just to get the feel of what it's all about, they might go and try and sniff as they're passing the kitchen as the smell's coming out. Chazal might say about that boy or that girl, they ate bacon. They never did, but it's telling a certain truth about them. What is this story which clearly never happened? What truth is it telling about Moshe Rabbeinu? So says Rabbi Dessler, an astonishing thing. He says, the truth is, again, it never happened. But the truth about Moshe Rabbeinu is, why is he happy and content to live with a man called Yisro? And the answer is, as we know, Yisro had been the Kohen Gadol, every idolatrous religion in the world that existed at the time. He joined it. He grew in the ranks, rose in the ranks, to become the head of it. Saw it was vapid and lies and sheker, rejected it and went on to the next one, and so on and so forth. It was a man who was seriously seeking the truth. And Moshe Rabbeinu recognizes this in him and happens to know the truth. So isn't it a good thing for him to stay and influence this man with the potential to innovate in Klal Yisrael, to become a Jew, innovate in Klal Yisrael, and have a Seder named after him? I would think that was a very great thing to do. But the Medrash here, which tells this story, is telling you the truth. And the truth is, it's very nice for Moshe Rabbeinu to want to stay and influence him, but what about the influence he's going to have on Moshe Rabbeinu? What about the influence he's going to have on you? Until he's Jewish, he's not Jewish. Therefore, your relationship with him is going to be one of exchange. It's a debate, it's a conversation, maybe an argument sometimes, where ideas are exchanged. That has an effect. And the astonishing thing, says Rabbi Dessler, that you'll find our posuk was Vayoel Moshe Losheves Es Hoish. 5 words. There's another posuk which comes in Shoftim. So, of course, after the Torah, after the Chumash, you've got Yeshua, after the book of Yeshua, then you've got Shoftim, the book of Judges. And there you'll find in Yud Zayin, Yud Aleph, almost the exact same posuk. Ours was Vayoel Moshe Losheves Es Hoish. And Moshe was content to live with a man. There it says Vayoel Haledi Losheves Es Hoish. And the lady was content to live with the man. Who was the man? Micha. Who was the Levim? Who answered the advertisement to come and become priests to his idolatrous shrine that he'd set up in the land of Israel? Moshe Rabbeinu's grandsons. Gemara says Moshe Rabbeinu's grandsons became Kamrim, priests of Avodah Zarah. It's almost as though the effect of living in that environment had affected Moshe Rabbeinu and came out in his grandson, which he passed on to his son, and came out to full force in his grandsons later on. That's the point. If the greatest Jew who ever lived is going to be, can be, and was negatively affected by that sort of a negative environment, negative associations, then of course Lot would be too. Now, he doesn't think he is. He doesn't believe he is, but he is at the end of the day. He really is. And here there's a distinction between Rav Simcha Zissel and Rabbi Dessler. Let me read this to you on page 154. It's astonishing to think the impact and the powerfulness, the potency of an environment, both either negative or positive. If the person comes close to an environment which is not so conducive to being from Jew, even if his intention is of the highest, for the highest reasons, as Lot was. But still, there has to be an agreement. There has to be a subconscious understanding which you're willing to make or willing to accept deep in your heart, levata kitsas and hogus ba'avoidus lekabel kitsas mekulas asvivish alakatson. That you're going to have to relax your own standards a little bit in this alien, non-conducive, anti-Torah environment. And that will, of course, feed into your family. And then he says, and that can affect even the most important things. But says Rabbi Esther, you should know that the sakana, the danger that you face, is not ultimately hidden from you. You know, you are aware of it. So if you know you're aware of it, Lot knew he was aware of it. But he felt that he could overcome that because he was a Talmud of Avrohom Avinu. I can't remember where I saw this. I saw it a couple of years ago. It was a brilliant observation. But somebody put at the end of a long Vartar, which I won't quote now. He said, it's not good enough having been attached to a tzaddik. Are you still attached to a tzaddik? It's not good enough having been attached to a tzaddik. Are you still attached to a tzaddik? So here we have Lot, who's got all the background, and indeed is a tzaddik, as Rav Simcha Zissel says, and he's been Odom Mohammed on Machaveri, and all the education he got from Avrohom Avinu, but he's no longer attached to it. And famously, Rashi says when they part ways, and he goes to Sodom, then you'll find this in Parshas Voyairo. So Parshas Lech Lecho, when he goes to live in Sodom, so it says, where is this? Yud Aleph, Medrash Agada. Then he says about Medrash Agada. This is Yud Gimel and Yud Apostle Yud Aleph. Medrash Agada Asiya Atzum Mekadem Shalom. At that point, he turned away from being in front of God. I no longer have any connection to Avram and to his God. That doesn't make sense. For all that he did, all we saw that he did, the Rav Simcha Zissel quoted that he did, his hospitality to other people, his relationship with God, keeping matzah, keeping Pesach. This was after he separated himself. It's talking very much like we said in the story of Yisro. At the subconscious level, he was aware that he was giving up. There was a danger. And why? Because he disconnected from Avrohom. It's not good enough to have been connected to a tzaddik. Are you still connected to a tzaddik? And there's that medrash I can't resist telling you when Esau is trying to kill Yaakov before the reunion, the two brothers come together. Amalek comes and starts to beat him. He says, "Leave me alone. I'm Esau. I'm a son of Avrohom." And the angel continued to beat him. I'm a grandson of Avrohom. I'm a son of Yitzhak. Beat him. I am a brother of Yaakov. Oh, then he stopped beating him. It's not good enough to have been related to these people. Are you still related to Tzadik? In cutting himself off from his relationship to Avrohom Avinu, he's no longer connected to Tzadik. Now, I've seen this many times incidentally. Rabbi Esther, on this issue, there was a letter once sent him about doing kiruv v'chokim, going to a community as a rabbi. So you spent a long time in a yeshiva, perhaps like mine, Gateshead, and you want to go and be a rabbi b'shul for some peculiar reason. Obviously, you don't want to be paid very much and have people attack you often and frequently. But quite seriously, you're an ambitious young man to spread for spreading Torah, and you want to become the rabbi b'shul. But what would the effect that the shul is going to have on you? So Rabbi Dessler did not believe that it was a healthy thing to do. He believed in going and influencing other Jews, but he liked the idea of a kollel, a group. I was in a kollel in Liverpool. He liked the idea of a group of Jews going and being mashpia, and of course being self-sustaining by their contacts. But I know from my own time in Gateshead, there were one or two Rabbanim come to my mind as well, who were great, and fitted nicely into Gateshead, saw themselves proudly, as I do, as being Gateshead men, Gateshead Talmidim. But when, after a while, they became rabbis of certain synagogues, that fire, that passion had disappeared. It's essential to keep connected, which is why, of course, in the Hasidic world, Hasidim make regular pilgrimages to see the Rebbe. It's why in the yeshiva world, very often boys go back to the yeshiva for a week or so to learn. Sorry, boys, men, married men. Gates the yeshiva star has been doing that recently. I've twice tried to be there and not managed it. Mir has an annual a Yarkikala, a week where men come back and reconnect and regain that excitement they had when they were there. You've got to keep connected to Tzadik. Lot was a great man. He could have had a parsha named after him, the Torah, but his connection to Avrohom was in the past. And if your connection to Tzadik, your inspiration, your inspirer is in the past, the inspiration will soon start to die, and you'll find yourself no longer being as great as you could have. I wish you a wonderful Shabbos. Shabbos.